What's up, guys? It's Toad back again. I actually slept for once. So I'm not doing this late night. I'm doing it really early morning. So I probably look even worse because of it, which is awesome. College football, week 12. Yeah, let's go. Let's do it. Let's try to be less long-winded here. This is interesting. We get down the stretch here. Most of these teams have like one game left in the regular season. So you really got to look at kind of like motivational angles here. Which teams are bowl eligible already? Which teams are not? Where's the motivation coming from? Is it a team's final home game? Things like that. Got to look at all those types of things. College football has not been that great to me this season. I had a nice run of a couple weeks there towards the end. I think I had 2-3-1 weeks in a row, and then last week, what was that? 2-2. I don't even remember. I think it was 2-2 last week, which slight loss. I think for the most part, I think my handicapping was right on those games. It's just, yeah, sometimes they don't get there. Forgetting about that, though, let's take a look at this week. What do we got going on first this week? Let's jump right into it, baby. And we're laying the wood. We're laying the lumber. Laying a huge price on this first one, and it's Wyoming minus 13.5. So what do I see with this Wyoming game? There are a bunch of things that I like about this. Not the market read here, though, because it looks like the market is going against that, having dropped them from 14 to 13, it looks like here, even though I'm only seeing 13.5s everywhere, but 13.5, not much of a difference there. 91% of the tickets, but only 60% of the cash. So what's up here? Why do I like Wyoming? Well, it starts with, what did Hawaii do in their last game? That is the question. The main reason I'm going to fade Hawaii here is because they beat Air Force. Huge upset. This game against the Air Force, man, they pulled off a huge upset of 22.5 points. This is a gigantic win. This is like Hawaii's win of the season. They were at home when they did it. But because it was in Hawaii, it might look a little bit less impressive to the more astute bettors, let's say, because you can kind of explain reasons why Air Force was not really in the best spot here, and they really just kind of dropped this game. So not only, yeah, it was in Hawaii, so it's an odd spot for most of these teams to really have to go out to and play. So not really a good spot for Air Force, like geographically, travel-wise. Looking at the numbers here, though, the game was pretty close, really, statistically, but Air Force lost the game with 4 turnovers. And I think in their previous game, which I think is kind of why they lost this game. So when you have 4 turnovers, though, you're just not going to win, man. You're not going to win that game. It makes the game look different than it actually was, really. It makes the score more lopsided than it actually was. This game was much closer than the final. It actually makes it look 4 turnovers. That's just like a lapse of discipline pretty much on the part of Air Force, which is odd with these service academies. You usually get a lot of discipline from these teams. But the other thing about the spot that Air Force was in was that they were actually in a bad spot, partially also because they had just lost their first game of the season to Army, and that game looked awful too, 23-3. And I kind of wish I went against Army after that. Army actually played Holy Cross, so they actually stepped down into like FCS football for the next game. I couldn't find a line on it, but Army almost lost to Holy Cross after that. So Army was in like a huge letdown spot, and coming off a game where they looked way too good, way better than they actually were. Because in this game against Air Force is a big favorite again, 17.5, and they lost this one even though they actually outgained Army. They outplayed them statistically a bit. 6 turnovers in that one. So Air Force in those 2 games were a combined minus 10 in turnovers. And that's the whole story about why they lost those games. But I think because Air Force had lost this game and it's against one of the service academies, even though Army not really that good this year, still it's a big rivalry when you face one of the other service academies. That dealt Air Force their first loss. So they were coming off that game. Then they had to come in and play Hawaii. They had to go out to Hawaii. So that made it a bad spot for Air Force for a couple different reasons. So that Army game, when you lose that game, sometimes it's said that you like lose that game twice because you have that undefeated season going and then you lose the undefeated season and then it's just like, ooh, that's brutal, man. And then you slip up again, and that's what happened to Air Force, and they actually fell into a conference tie with UNLV because of that. So lost a game on UNLV because of that, which is wild. And yeah, I don't know if there's much else to say about the spot that Air Force was in there, but it was certainly a bad spot. So Hawaii was able to take advantage of that, pull off the upset. My only hesitation, so Hawaii's in a massive letdown spot, and I had to come over to the mainland and go to Wyoming. And it's going to be cold, 36 degrees, it looks like. So it's not going to be great weather for a Hawaii team that maybe is not used to it, even though, of course, being in this conference, they do have to come over and play some games in these locations, but not many, because a lot of these teams are in warmer environments here in California and stuff. So not the best travel spot for Hawaii either. The only hesitation that I have a little bit here is that with that game, Hawaii actually remained, they maintain the possibility of bowl eligibility because they won that game somehow. They could possibly win their last two games and still become bowl eligible. I think they know it's kind of like a pipe dream. Before going into that Air Force game, I think they really did not think that they had any shot at it. And now, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. Maybe they still have those thoughts. We're really not going to be able to get bowl eligibility anyway, even though we did just pull off that huge win. I mean, before those last two games, really, because they beat Nevada as well. Before those two, I think it was just there was no thought of them potentially being bowl eligible. But now it is true that if they win their last two games, I think they will become bowl eligible. But having to go to Wyoming off of that massive, massive win, monster win, they're easily their biggest win of the season, not close. This is just a bad spot, and then they come home for the final game to play their final home game, which is senior night and all those things, so usually a big game, even though I am going to be playing against one team that is in that situation, which we'll see in a minute. There are reasons for it. So, yeah, I mean, there are situations where I think they're strong enough that one, slight situational disadvantage that kind of goes out the window, and I think that's the case for Hawaii here. I think bowl eligibility, They don't really have a realistic expectation to do that. And Wyoming, they're in a positive spot. So Wyoming is already bowl eligible, which I think played into why they played so poorly in their last game. That was a primetime game on a Friday night, actually. So Wyoming has an extra day off here, I believe, because I think Hawaii's game was on a Saturday. So Wyoming might have a little bit extra advantage here for that as well, for having that extra time off. But they're coming off a really ugly loss at UNLV, even though, it's a good team, UNLV, but they got blown out. So they might want to atone for that embarrassing loss there. And the other thing is that I thought that was a bad spot for Wyoming because they had just become bowl eligible, and it was in the Border War game, which is a rivalry game, even though Colorado State's not very good this year. But Wyoming was able to get that win, and they were coming off this whole slew of big games, really. Fresno, Air Force, Boise. Boise's still a big name, even though maybe they're a little bit down this year. So going into UNLV on primetime, UNLV, I think they treated that as a step-up game. They never have home primetime games like that. It was on one of the national networks, I think. So that was a big game for UNLV. So Wyoming just dropped that game. They were coming off the big rivalry win, had just gained bowl eligibility. So that's what happened there. So, and in that game, I'd mentioned that I leaned UNLV in that one. UNLV has a good rushing attack, which is the way that you beat Wyoming, really. They're not great at stopping the run. Hawaii, I don't think really is going to have that advantage, that matchup advantage there. UNLV, much better at doing that than Hawaii is. So I had said I liked UNLV, but the market actually shifted the other way, late on that Friday night last week, so it was kind of interesting. The line had actually gone up to UNLV 5, and then it dropped all the way to a 3. So I was like, oh, what's this late movement going against UNLV? So that was weird. But anyway, that's the situation. I don't think there's much else to say there. When it comes down to it, Hawaii, I mean, you can see all these other factors that I talked about, but Hawaii's in a major, major letdown spot off of that huge win over Air Force. And Wyoming is in more of a bounce back spot with some extra time off. And it is their final home game. So I expect Wyoming to show up, and I expect them to be able to win by margin here. So that's the rare occasion where I'm laying a large amount of points. And it's not going to be the case with the rest of these. So let's giddy up, baby. These are going to be the tight ones. Arizona -1. So what do I like about this Arizona game here? Well, let's take a look at it. Take a look at the market. First, I do like the market read on this one. They're playing Utah. They've ticked up from a pick'em to a -1 at home, and they have 55% of the cash, but 53% of the tickets are on Utah. So it looks like the public is kind of still on the Utah side, even though it looks like the money and the cash discrepancy, like, and where the respected money is moving the line, are all kind of on the Arizona side, moving it up. So you might remember I was against Arizona last week because I thought they were in a bad spot, but now I think they're in a much more positive spot, and I think Utah's in the bad spot. And this is kind of it's odd that now Arizona has actually vaulted Utah in the rankings. So Arizona's actually moved up above Utah to being ranked 17, where Utah's at 22. But I don't really see Utah using that as much of a motivation, like, oh, now Arizona is ahead of us. Like, I don't know. Like, will they really treat it as that big a game coming off what they just played? That's the thing. So the reason I'm going against Utah here is they just played a close game against Washington, who's the undefeated team, the team atop the Pac-12 on the road, and now they have a second straight road game, kind of unfamiliar territory, even though it is in the conference, so it's not like they never play there. But even so, this is a huge game against Washington they're coming off of, and Utah was in that game, man. They were winning the game by 1 in the third quarter there. They wound up losing, and they were still only down a touchdown, and oddly, it looks like no points were scored in the fourth quarter of that game, but that game was within grasp for Utah. They played it tight. They played it pretty close. A close game for Utah, man. So coming off that, I think they're going to be in kind of a hangover spot, a letdown spot. And other than the fact that, yeah, we're playing an Arizona team that's now ranked ahead of us, what does Utah really have to play for? Really, they don't have much to play for, in my opinion. Yeah, what else we got here? So Washington, were they in a bad spot there as well? I don't even know. Well, Washington, yeah. So Washington, you could kind of, yeah, that's right. You could kind of explain why they had kind of a lackluster performance against Utah as well, because they were coming off a big game against USC. USC, big in name, even though they've fallen in the rankings and they haven't really done that well recently this season. They've kind of let the season slip away, but that was still a huge win for Washington. So they were coming off that and then having to, come back home, play Utah with this, I guess, another bigger game, which I'll mention in a bit. Excuse me. Coming off that game, they had the Oregon State game on the horizon. I just think it was a bad spot for Washington there in a way. So they almost got caught, but they were still able to barely do it and beat Arizona there, and beat Utah there. And Utah, yeah, like they have their final home game up next, but that kind of explains why, like that. That might look a little bit better than it was, because Washington was actually in a bad spot. So Utah's performance might look a little bit better than it really was because of that. But they had that game that was within reach. We're potentially going to be able to pull off a nice big upset there over Washington. Couldn't do it. Now they have the second straight road game. I don't know how much attention you're really going to be paying to Arizona, even though they're in the rankings, but you're coming off that biggest game of the year, really, against Washington. You played it tough, and then you have your final home game up next, which is against Colorado, even though all the hype has died off on Colorado. You might be looking forward to that anymore. There's not much else to say about Utah at this point. They're already bowl eligible. They can't win the Pac-12 at this point. They don't have much else to play for. Like, the only thing that could motivate them here, really, like I said, is that, we're playing another ranked team here. Yeah, but it's a much lesser opponent than the game that you just came off of. That was your, like, kind of huge game where you tried to make that, like, huge statement. And on the Arizona side, I had mentioned last week when I went against them, they played this gauntlet, man. They played Washington, and they played Washington within a touchdown, too. Took USC to overtime, I think, on the road, and that was when we were kind of realizing, hey, Arizona's actually maybe a decent team here. They came back home and just absolutely wrecked Washington State in a spot that I thought was going to be a negative for them, coming off that really crazy USC game. Then they kept going, coming back home, beat Oregon State, too, and UCLA. And last week, I was like, it's gone too far, man. Like, after so many step-up games in a row, this has to be, like, a game where they, like, look past their opponent a bit, and that's what happened with Colorado. So they were losing a lot of that game as double-digit favorites at Colorado. So now that that's out of the way, that might shock Arizona like back into focus a little bit with that lackluster game that they had against Colorado, that last one. Colorado, yeah, I mean, the hype is gone, so I don't know how seriously Arizona was taking them at that point, and they found a way to win the game, which tells you this team has some amount of resolve, really. They can win these close games, and as you can see with the prior games, they're able to win games against tough opponents too. So that was a game, yeah, they played poorly in that game. They were behind pretty late in that game, so that might shock them into refocus here. Now this is their final home game, even though they do have their rivalry against Arizona State left. Yeah, how focused are you going to be? Are you really going to be looking ahead to an Arizona State team that's bowl banned this year, and they're not going to make a bowl anyway? They're not going to get enough wins, even though, yeah, it is a rivalry. I think that game's going to mean much more to Arizona State than it does to Arizona, to the point where I might wind up with a play on Arizona State in that one because of the motivational angles in play there. At that point, Arizona's not really going to have much to play for, and that'll be like Arizona State's Super Bowl. They'll treat it like their bowl game, kind of, I think, knowing that they're not going to a bowl. But Arizona, like, this is going to be like their final big game, I would say here. This is senior day. It's in the afternoon on Saturday. These games are afternoon games here on Saturday. Yeah, they're going to treat it like a bowl game. Well, not like a bowl game, but this is their final home game. So they're going to probably step up for it, treat it like a big game. So ranked team coming in. I think they're going to take Utah seriously. And they saw what Utah did against Washington, which they also were able to do against Washington. So that's what I have to say about that. Arizona -1 is going to be that play. Then the next play, you saw it there. I'm projecting it. This is the game where I'm going against a team that's in their final home game, and I think the spot is right for it. I'm laying North Texas on the road, and I think there are a couple of reasons why. It looks like the line's gone down to 1 here, but it's actually 2 pretty much everywhere. So they've gone down from 2.5 to 2 on the road. North Texas at Tulsa, but it looks like they have 95% of the cash, but only 62% of the tickets. This is one of those games that I don't think recreational bettors are really going to get much involved in this game. They're not going to want to pay attention to a game in this, what is it, Conference USA? Or, yeah, I think it's Conference USA. And teams that are just like bad records on the season, you're not going to want much to do with this at all. Or, sorry, it's them. I always get these confused because so many of these teams used to be in the USA. This is the American Athletic Conference. Sorry, American Athletic, yeah. So what do we got going on here? Well, for Tulsa, I think this is a bad spot for Tulsa. That's the main reason I'm going against this, is because what did they do in their last game? They had a huge game against Tulane where they're a 24.5-point underdog at Tulane, who's like leading the conference, basically undefeated in conference, ranked, have 1 loss on the season, have been playing real well. Tulane's still got their great quarterback there, Pratt, I believe. Pratt did not do well in this game, though, against Tulsa. Tulsa, yeah, really, they outplayed Tulane in this game, man. As you can see here, they outyarded them, out first down them. They almost outpossessed them. Tulsa had chances to win this game. They were behind for most of it, or for basically all of it. They were in the game, man. They wound up losing the game by 2 when they got that touchdown near the end there, and that was because they missed a 2-point conversion. So they were within 1 score for the whole fourth quarter here. They were down 5, and then they were down 8, and then they scored that touchdown, and they went for a 2-point conversion that would have tied the game against Tulane, and it failed with 3 minutes left in the game. So they were that close to having a tie in this huge game against Tulane. They almost were able to pull off a massive, massive upset there. So now after that, and what was the spot that Tulane was in there? I don't know, but that... Man, Tulsa almost able to pull off that upset. Yeah, Tulane wasn't really in a bad spot necessarily, but Tulsa just really played out of their minds in that game. And now coming off that, it's like, what does Tulsa have left in the tank, really? So that's the thing. Tulsa's coming off a gigantic game. So even though this is their final home game, are they really going to be able to replicate that performance, what they just did in that game against Tulane? That was a huge performance, huge game for them. I think it's going to be pretty difficult for them to replicate that. So I think they're in a bad spot, even though, yeah, this is their final home game, so it is senior day and whatever. But man, like that is a tough game to come off of. Again, that was their big game of the year, and they almost were able to have it. They almost beat Tulane. I don't know what they're going to have left. I think it's a hangover spot for Tulsa, even though it is their final home game. it's a spot that's, I think, bad enough for Tulsa that I'm going to go against it. And I think the market does look like it's kind of agreeing with me here. On the other side, North Texas, yeah, I mean, they lost to SMU, but SMU is a pretty good team, and they did lose to them by a lot of points there, by 24 points. So it wasn't really close. So they're going to be wanting a win here, even though they do have a final home game up next in a winnable game against UAB. They want some wins here, man. Neither of these teams are going to be able to be bowl eligible this year. They're both 1-5. They're both 3-7. So I think it's a spot where North Texas, they're going to be able to refocus on this, even though it is their second road game. They're coming off a bunch of losses. They're going to want to win here, and it's just like I said, it's an awful spot for Tulsa, even though it is their final home game, coming off that near huge upset for them. And then North Texas, yeah, they played a bunch of games in a row, so they also played Tulane pretty close. But the average bettor might look at this and say, yeah, well, first of all, North Texas, yeah, they played Tulane, then they played Memphis. They played all these teams pretty close except SMU. UTSA and then SMU. So they played the top 4 teams in the conference there all in a row and lost all those games. So those are their 4 losses. So I do think Tulsa had a tougher earlier season schedule, but the recent schedule has been much more difficult for North Texas, which is why they lost all those games. And people, like I was about to say, they're going to look at this and see these teams have the same records. Tulsa's at home, so why is North Texas a road favorite? So that might look sus to people, and people kind of know, like, that final home game is a game where teams do kind of step it up. So, like, average bettors, if they look at this game and get involved, they might think, like, there's something up with this line and think, like, there's value in taking Tulsa as the home underdog in their final home game. I look at it differently. Of course, Tulsa's in that major letdown spot, but the odds makers are telling you North Texas is actually the better team, and they've played the tougher slew of conference opponents here, at least in their latest group of games here. So North Texas, I think, is the way to go there. That's going to do that. And then the final game, which I actually think is maybe the strongest of these, South Carolina +2. So I think this is a bad spot for Kentucky in this one. So Kentucky, what's going on with them? Well, first, I guess, yeah, we'll look at the market real quickly here. So Kentucky, they've actually been dropping from -2 down to 1.5, so it's kind of in the 1.5 range now. There are some 2s still out there. They have 67% of the cash and of the tickets on them, but I do think that they're the public road favorite here, and why not? They have the better record. People have been overlooking South Carolina pretty much all year. And Kentucky had that hot start to the season where they were ranked and everybody thought they were pretty good. Looking at their records, people are still going to think Kentucky's the better team. And the line is telling you that they are the better team, but laying only a couple on the road, it almost looks suspicious. It almost looks too easy in this case to take Kentucky as the team with the obviously better record and the team that has the more name recognition and the team that everybody thinks and knows is better. So something's kind of up with the way that line looks. It looks too easy to get involved on Kentucky there. And what is Kentucky? What do they have going on? They just played Alabama, even though, yeah, it was not that close against Alabama. But even so, that's Alabama coming into your house. You played that game. That was your final home game. So that was a pretty big game for Kentucky. Yeah, and they lost. Now they have to go to South Carolina, which in that spot, are you really going to want to go to South Carolina and play that? And up next, you have Louisville in your Kentucky rivalry game. Now, these teams are rivals, man. And Louisville is kind of like the bigger brother, to Kentucky at this point now, at least, since Louisville's ranked in the top 10 now. Kentucky's out of the rankings, so I think Kentucky is going to have one eye looking ahead to that game. That's a big rivalry game. Kentucky doesn't really have much to play for, man. They're already bowl eligible. They already have 6 wins. These recent games, they've really let it slip. They were 5-0 at one point, and then once they started facing like tougher opponents, they were just dropping these games, and there's just not really much for them to want to play for here. Like I said, they're already bowl eligible. Not much going on for them. And with South Carolina, what's going on with them? Well, South Carolina, they had an easier game last week, easier 2 games in a row, really. Nobody's going to be paying attention to them because they had those some tough SEC matchups here that they lost. Then they went out, they played Jacksonville State and didn't really even play that well, but they were coming off a tough SEC slate there. And then they played Vanderbilt coming back to the SEC. So that was almost like a tune-up type of game. But I think that's good because it's going to help South Carolina gain some like confidence, gain some momentum. They're coming into this game with Kentucky. This is not their final home game, actually, because they have a home game next as well against Clemson. But what that does mean is something that I think was that they weren't thinking of like a couple weeks ago when they were 2-6. Now they're 4-6. South Carolina, they are still possibly bowl eligible. And what do they have to do? They have to win these last 2 games, man. And this is a winnable game. You can see in the line. They can win this game against Kentucky. And I think the Clemson game at home might actually be winnable too. Like, and that's, yeah, it's a big South Carolina rivalry game. So normally I would say South Carolina might actually be looking ahead to that. I don't think you're going to be looking ahead to anybody when you're sitting at 4 wins with 2 games left and you want bowl eligibility. Most likely, if you're South Carolina, you can do it if you win these games. You've had easy games the last 2 opponents that you've faced, so you're going to be in the much better rest spot here. Kentucky's in a spot where they don't really have much to play for, and it's sandwiched in between 2 bigger games. So I like that. I think that one might be the strongest of these 4 plays. So that's going to be that. So those are the 4 plays quickly. Wyoming minus 13.5, Arizona minus 1, North Texas minus 2, South Carolina plus 2. And, yeah, commenting on some of these other games real quickly. I don't know what other games there really are, but what I do is I like to look at the schedule first and see, like, what did these teams play last week? Did they have, like, big games or whatever? So one of the games I noticed was, yeah, Virginia had a close game against Louisville. So I'd be like, okay, well, maybe they played a tough game against Louisville, only lost by 7 there. So, like, what do they have up next? Virginia. Well, they're facing Duke. Duke's a 3.5-point road favorite, and Duke has 56% of the cash, but 71% of the tickets. So Duke, they're still the name. They're going to get the name recognition. Everybody knows they're the better team, so they're still going to be the public road favorite there. But Duke themselves, I believe they're coming off a really difficult multiple overtime loss to North Carolina. So I look at that, and I'm just like, I don't want to play either of these teams. So that's kind of the situation there. They're both in negative spots, Duke and Virginia. Otherwise, I think Duke is in like a massive hangover spot off of that game against North Carolina there. I think that's what it was. Yeah. So that's a tough game for Duke to be coming off of for sure. But like I said, Virginia's coming off a tough game. Virginia does have the extra rest though, but they're coming off of playing Louisville pretty tough. So that's what keeps me off of that a little bit, even though it's more negative for Duke, having less rest and having it be their second straight road game. And Duke's already bowl eligible, so they don't have much to play for. So I guess the small lean would be to Virginia there, but there's not that much going on there. Penn State, as we know, they played a huge game last week up against Michigan. They dropped that game. It wasn't even really that close as the final made it look. I don't think Michigan just was the better team, man. Came into Penn State's house, beat them. That was a step-up game for Penn State. I don't know how much left Penn State has to play for really at this point. They're already going to be in some bowl. Like maybe they want to try to get into a better bowl by maintaining this record, but they're up to a 20.5-point favorite from 19 with 53% of the cash, but 56% of the tickets on Rutgers. So it actually looks like the market is playing Penn State, which I don't fully understand that, but because they are coming off that big game against Michigan, but I think it is because this is their final home game. So even though they are coming off that big game, they might still step it up for their final home game, I guess. So that might be what keeps me off of this a little bit. And Rutgers, yeah, I mean, they're not coming off of much. So, I mean, the lean might still slightly be to Rutgers there, I would say, even though the market looks against it. Rutgers got blanked by Iowa, so even though that was a game against a ranked team, it's like, yeah, it's kind of a bad-looking loss, ugly loss there. North Carolina, as I mentioned, they played that tough game against Duke. They won in double overtime, whatever. They're at Clemson. Clemson's gone down from 7 to 6.5, 76% of the cash on North Carolina and 54% of the tickets on Clemson. So I don't know what's going on there. It looks like the market is very much signaling against Clemson there. Clemson, I mean, they have that sort of rivalry game against South Carolina, but they're always like the bigger brother pretty much in that rivalry. So I I don't really see the angle for going against Clemson here, really. They just played Georgia Tech and beat them pretty easily, unfortunately for me, because I'm pretty sure I was on Georgia Tech in that one. I thought that was a bad spot for Clemson after coming off a big win over Notre Dame and having this North Carolina game up next. But now they do have North Carolina. It looks like the odds makers are on North Carolina, but North Carolina's coming off that overtime rivalry win against Duke. So I don't know. It seems like North Carolina's in the more negative spot there. James Madison is in one of the weirdest spots that I've seen. It looks like there is movement that has moved them down from -12 to -9 as a home favorite against Appalachian State. But even though it looks like they have 64% of the cash but only 57% of the tickets, it looks like the market move has gone against that, at least on Appalachian State. And the thing about this, so I think there is a bunch of professional money on App State here, even though it looks like the cash discrepancy is kind of going against it. And I think you've lost some value at this point with the number being under 10 now at this point on James Madison, although it is a weird spot for James Madison, I will say. Even though they're undefeated, they have game day coming into town, which is very rare. So it's like that's going to be a motivational factor, I would think. They want to maintain the undefeated season, and they have college game day coming in, national TV. It's going to be a big game, a rare national TV appearance for them. I think they're going to want to look good, but the thing is, they just applied for early bowl eligibility because they're, I believe, only in their first season moving into FBS. So there's like a 2-season waiting period or something before you can become bowl eligible. And they applied to become bowl eligible this year because they're in the rankings. They're undefeated. It looks like they might be able to win the Sun Belt. Well, of course they might be able to. They're undefeated and leading the Sun Belt. They want to try to get into like a New Year's Six bowl or something like that, like a big bowl. NCAA just denied their application, though. So is that going to be like I think that might be why the play is against them there. Other than I think maybe they're overvalued a little bit just because their record is so good. But App State's a pretty good team. I think their passing attack is like really good on the App State side, and App State is a pretty experienced program as well that has been in bowls and done pretty well in recent years. James Madison, are they going to be in like a negative situation because of that bowl eligibility denial factor? I don't know. Like game day there might hype them up enough. They might be good to go in this game. That might like have them stepping it up, but I think it's just weird. They were denied bowl eligibility, so are they going to be like down a little bit because of that denial? Or will it like make them want to step up even more because now they don't have a bowl that they're going to be in? So are they going to be focused on like winning these games and start treating them like their bowl? I don't know. I could see that going either way. So I just figured I'd mention that because it's a little bit weird. It's kind of hard to handicap, I would say. And then what other big games? We got Georgia's playing Tennessee. Georgia's number one, of course. They're a 10-point road favorite. Looks like they have 90% of the cash, but only 86% of the tickets. But they're going to be a public road favorite here. I would really only look to Tennessee here with the way things have played out. Georgia just won again. What did they just play? I think they had a big game, right? I don't even know. What did they do? Georgia, they played Ole Miss, and they absolutely massacred Ole Miss. That was a huge win. They do have the rivalry game against Georgia Tech up next, too, although I don't think you're going to overlook Tennessee necessarily for Georgia Tech because Tennessee is also a ranked team still as well. But Georgia coming off, looking way too good. Like the stock could not get any higher on Georgia. They just wiped out Ole Miss, who was a top 10 ranked team. Georgia absolutely dominated them, and Tennessee had an awful game against Missouri, where I thought Missouri was in a bad spot because they were in some sort of letdown spot. I don't really remember, but Tennessee really almost didn't even show up. That was an embarrassing loss for Tennessee, I would say, even though it was to a ranked team on the road. You're going to want to bounce back from that, and maybe they were looking ahead to this bigger game against Georgia, where I don't know if this is Tennessee's final home game or not, but this is like, I think Tennessee might have been looking ahead to this. I don't know. I don't even see Tennessee on here. I was just looking. Oh, no, I was looking at Ole Miss. Tennessee was at Missouri. Is this their final home game? No, they do have Vandy left at home, but still, it's a huge game when you have Georgia coming into your house there, and Missouri. They were coming off the Georgia game, so that's why I kind of did not like Missouri in that one because they were coming off playing Georgia pretty close, and then that's going to be I don't know what else to say about this race. I thought Missouri was kind of in a bad spot there, but they just wiped out Tennessee. Tennessee had to have had one eye looking ahead to this. I think they're going to want to play a better game than that. That's just an embarrassing loss, no matter who you lose to. If you lose that badly, 42-7 or whatever it was, you're going to want to play better in your next game and step it up. So that's the way I would look there. And then I said I would mention it because it's the final like big game that we have here, maybe the biggest game that's out there. Washington and Oregon State, between these two Pac-12, not really rivals necessarily, but the Pac-12 powerhouses at this point. Who would have thought, like, now Oregon State is one of the top 3 Pac-12 teams with Washington and Oregon there, and I think they're being overlooked a bit, man. So Washington, they got 59% of the tickets on them, but 64% of the cash on Oregon State. Oregon State's gone up from a pick'em to -2.5. At homes, the market movement looks like it's on Oregon State. Looks like there are professionals getting involved, playing Oregon State. Looks like the smarter money's there. It's driven the number up against where the public is, and it looks like the cash discrepancy is on the Oregon State side. Tells me some of the bigger bets are on Oregon State there. And, so it looks like a pros versus Joes almost type of situation here. And a game where, the public, Washington's undefeated, of course. So they're going to want to be on Washington. They have that great offense. They've seen Washington. They like what they've seen out of Washington. But I don't know, man. Washington, as the season progresses, man, that undefeated status becomes harder and harder to maintain. And you're coming off a pretty tough game against a physical Utah team. And now you have to go on the road. And your final home game is going to be that rivalry against Washington State. But they've been playing pretty badly. So I don't know if Washington's really going to have that much of a look-ahead aspect to this year. Probably not when you're playing a very highly ranked team in Oregon State. I think both teams are going to want to show up for this. But this is a huge game for Oregon State, man. They're going to probably want to use this as a statement game. Washington, as I was saying, like, you have like a target on your back the further you go into a season undefeated. Oregon State had just kind of like a tune-up last week against Stanford, an easy win, whereas Washington had that much tougher game where they just had to escape against Utah, really. And Oregon State does have Oregon, their huge rivalry, in-state rival up next, which is another huge game. Of course, Oregon being very highly ranked. But you're not going to overlook Washington coming into your house in your final home game. I think this is going to be a tough game for Washington. Washington has a more one-dimensional offense than Oregon State does, I would say. Washington, they're known as a passing offense, and Oregon State can do both, man. They're a balanced attack on offense. This is an interesting game, and it does look like the money is on Oregon State and going that way. I would have to lean that way as long as you can play it at less than a field goal, or if you can get like a decent money line price playing Oregon. That's Oregon State. That's the way I would look at that. That's going to do it for me, man. So those plays one more time: Wyoming -13.5, Arizona -1, North Texas -2, South Carolina +2. Those are the 4 Toad endorsed plays. That's college football week 12. I am Tower Gang Toad on Twitter. Follow me for my humor and political shit posting, and follow the Tower Gang podcast. You can find us on like all the platforms. You can subscribe to our locals. We're at towergangpod.com for all the links. Support us with some money on the locals, man. We are the most offensive podcast on the planet. You're going to love it. And I think that's going to do it, man. Peace out.